For years, the prevailing belief within NATO was that their air defense shield was impenetrable. The general consensus was that modern radar technology had evolved to a point where it could see everything. The doctrine stated that the moment a hostile jet crossed into defended airspace, a sequence of inevitable events would begin. Search radars would mark the target. Tracking dishes would lock onto it. And interceptor aircraft would rise to meet the intruder long before it ever reached a strategic target. Because of this all-seeing network, military planners argued that low-level flying was a tactic of the past, outdated, dangerous, imprecise, and ultimately obsolete against modern detection grids. But this confidence was shattered during a daylight Cold War exercise over European terrain, where a specific group of Royal Air Force, RAF, crews proved that the sky had a blind spot no one wanted to admit existed. While the Americans and other allies were flying over the land, the RAF Tornado crews decided to fly inside it. They threaded their jets through valleys so tightly and at such low altitudes that the NATO radar screens didn't show aircraft. They showed chaos. The screens filled with broken returns and false echoes that looked like ground clutter or weather interference. While the radar operators were busy filtering out what they thought was noise, the Tornadoes were slipping through the net completely unseen. When the American operators finally realized they were watching ghosts instead of real aircraft, it raised a terrifying question. Were the sensors malfunctioning, or was there a massive hole in NATO's vision? This was the beginning of a lesson in hidden valor, where the RAF proved that a jet can indeed disappear into the land itself. To understand how they did it, you have to understand the machine. The RAF Tornado GR, one was never designed to look heroic or sleek. Compared the elegant air superiority fighters of the time, the Tornado was wide-bodied, blunt-nosed, and heavy, often burdened with drop tanks and weapon pylons. It didn't have the menacing look of an interceptor or the speed contest shape of a dogfighter. Instead, the Tornado was engineered like a high-precision machine tool. Everything about its design served one singular, terrifying purpose: to penetrate air defenses at ground level, closer to the earth than any sane pilot would choose to fly. The heart of this capability was a system that no other NATO aircraft possessed at the same level of sophistication: the Terrain Following Radar, TFR. This wasn't just a warning device that beeped when the ground got too close. It was a command system. The radar scanned the area beneath the aircraft's nose in continuous sweeps, building a predictive map of every hill, valley, tree line, and ridge. It then fed control laws directly into the flight computer. The system didn't just advise the pilots. It actually flew the aircraft. It could hold the jet at 500 feet, 200 feet, or even lower, while traveling at speeds of over 540 knots. Where a human pilot might see a hillside too late to react, the TFR saw it 20 seconds in advance, adjusting pitch and roll to carve a precise three-dimensional corridor through the landscape. It treated the rigid earth like a fluid, and the Tornado flowed through it. Across NATO training wings, the Tornado's capabilities were viewed with deep skepticism rather than fear. Many Allied instructors questioned the survivability of such a system. They argued that radar couldn't possibly respond to terrain nuances at jet speeds reliably. Others doubted the wisdom of the tactic itself, believing that no crew could or should trust automation that close to the unforgiving ground. Some went even further, suggesting that if the system worked at all, it was only safe in calm peacetime conditions and would never hold up under the stress of combat. The American stance in joint briefings was plain. Low-altitude flight was a transitional tactic for survival, not a doctrine for deep strikes. The British said nothing in response. They simply prepared the aircraft that would prove the opposite. The scheduled Cold War exercise was designed to settle these debates. The Tornadoes were tasked with simulating a low-level strike against hardened targets positioned behind dense NATO detection belts. American and Allied radar stations would monitor the air picture, expecting a routine sequence: detection first, pursuit second, and interception long before weapon release. On the morning of the flight, for Tornado crews briefed quietly. They didn't review airspace blocks. They reviewed maps etched with contour lines, river valleys, and mountain seams. Their rule was absolute: never climb unless forced, never widen turns, and trust the radar implicitly. Once airborne, the four aircraft leveled off briefly before descending together. The western hills swallowed them whole. Inside the cockpit, the experience was surreal. At 200 feet, the terrain didn't just pass by. It rushed forward like a living wall. Ridges exploded upward in the windscreen, only to sink beneath the nose milliseconds later. Trees became indistinguishable blurs, and roads flashed below as distorted ribbons. The tornado didn't dart around obstacles. It flowed over them. The pilots rested their hands lightly on the controls, letting the terrain-following system execute hundreds of micro-adjustments per minute, pitch and roll commands that a human could never match in speed or precision. The pilots stopped monitoring the flight path and focused entirely on threats, because the Earth was racing closer than any jet had a right to fly. On the other side of Europe, the U.S. radar controllers watched their scopes, waiting for the border crossing that should have produced clear, immediate returns. Instead, they saw nothing coherent. At the low elevation bands, there were only vague flickers dancing in the background, the kind of noise operators were trained to ignore. It looked like ground clutter, atmospheric ducting, or weather-induced scatter. Following standard procedure, the operators adjusted their filters to sanitize the picture and remove the interference. What they didn't realize was that they were filtering out the enemy. Those vague flickers were the tornadoes, merging visually and electronically into the terrain, moving faster than the discrimination algorithms could isolate them. As the tornado formation crossed into the heart of the defense zone, the silence was deafening. No interceptors launched, no alarm sounded, and no threat calls went out. The ghosts had been dismissed as glitches. Somewhere between the hills and the sky, the RAF crews realized something astonishing. They weren't just low enough to evade detection. They were low enough to be mistaken for terrain itself. The first sign that something was wrong at the radar site was the absence of activity. The low-level channels remained unnaturally quiet. When a junior technician pointed out scatter below 200 feet, his supervisor dismissed it as ducting and ordered him to filter out. But today, the weather was moving with intent. Deep inside the mock-defended zone, the tornadoes cut through rolling valleys at nearly 550 knots. Their radars fired constantly, calculating the tunnel they were carving through the landscape. Inside the cockpits, the calm was eerie. The jets rose automatically over hill crests, clearing rocks and tree lines by mere feet before sliding back down into the next depression. The pilots barely touched the stick, their eyes glued to timing charts. Every second mattered. The objective was to reach the simulated release point before detection. If they succeeded, the exercise would register a full mission success. Back at the radar site, the computers were failing to process the reality of the situation. The tornado tracks were merging into background returns, becoming indistinguishable from terrain noise. Because the jets were moving so fast, each radar sweep painted them in a slightly different pocket of clutter, causing the correlation software to lose continuity. The system saw chaos, not motion. Finally, nearly 200 kilometers into the route, a veteran radar officer noticed that the clutter patches were sliding east against the wind. He widened the parameters, and suddenly the scope sparkled with motion, for faint tracks materialized where chaos had been. "Confirm targets," came the order, but it was too late. By the time the system accepted the returns as valid aircraft, the tornadoes had already crossed into the defended core. A red alert finally chimed, and interceptors were scrambled. 15 Eagles roared to life, climbing sharply toward predicted intercept corridors. However, the vectors they were given were already obsolete. The tornadoes were not what the radar thought they were, and the terrain masked them further. The interceptors arrived at the predicted zone to find empty sky. High-angle searches showed nothing. Low-level scans revealed nothing. The tornadoes were already gone. In the radar control room, operators began a replay analysis while the exercise was still technically running. They scrubbed backward to the raw data, removing the filters. Slowly, the picture resolved. There they were, 4 unmistakable tracks cutting straight through the defensive belt, uninterrupted from entry to weapons release. The realization hit the room with physical weight. The aircraft had crossed the entire defended zone without triggering a single successful intercept. As the tornadoes climbed safely for their return leg, radar contact finally snapped clean and the controller shouted, "Targets acquired." But the weapons release scoring had already been logged. The mission was a total success for the RAF. The debrief that followed didn't begin with accusations. It began with confusion. The technicians peeled back the layers of digital noise suppression until the raw truth emerged. The tornadoes had flown so low and so fast that the algorithms had classified them as noise. The American radar lead stared at the overlay and admitted that such a detection gap shouldn't exist. But the charts showed the reality. Above 1,500 feet, radar performance was perfect. Below 300 feet, coverage collapsed into a gray band where reflected energy merged with the ground. In peacetime, filtering the zone prevented false alarms. In war, it was a wide-open door. The most telling moment came when a British instructor spoke to his American counterpart. The American was puzzled, noting that they hadn't tried to beat the radar electronically. The RAF man replied calmly, "We never tried to beat your radar. We flew where your radar wasn't allowed to look." That sentence haunted NATO defense circles for years. It exposed a vulnerability in mindset. Defenders were shaping their search based on convenience, while the threat lay closer to the ground than anyone believed possible. The official report was written in neutral language, but the conclusions were heavy. It recommended an immediate expansion of counterterrain following research. In simple terms, NATO had learned it was blind near the ground. Because of what the tornadoes demonstrated, new programs were accelerated: optical tracking, infrared sensors, and AI clutter discrimination. The tornado crews received no medals for the exercise. To them, it was just a routine sortie flown correctly. They returned to their squadron refueled and prepared for the next flight. They were the workers of the sky, fly a machine that wasn't built for glory, but for discipline. The legacy of that day rippled across air defenses for decades, teaching NATO its most unsettling lesson. The sky does not start where the radar tells you it does.